The small town of Willow Glen had always been cloaked in fog and mystery. Perched on a windswept hill just outside its limits lay Black Hollow Cemetery, an ancient burial ground steeped in local legends and whispers. For as long as anyone could remember, it was a place avoided after sunset, a stark silhouette of twisted trees and crooked gravestones under the pale light of the moon. But for Emily, a newcomer to the town, Black Hollow was simply another curiosity. Emily was a skeptic, a journalist by trade, and someone who prided herself on unraveling superstition with facts. When she overheard patrons at the local diner trading ghost stories about Black Hollow, her interest was piqued. They spoke of strange lights flickering among the graves, the echo of whispers carried on the wind, and the chilling tale of the gravedigger's curse. They said no one who dared enter the cemetery after midnight ever left unchanged. To Emily, it all sounded like folklore. That night, armed with a flashlight, a notepad, and her camera, she set out to debunk the myths surrounding Black Hollow Cemetery. As she passed through the rusted iron gates, an icy breeze sent a shiver down her spine. The grave markers stretched before her like jagged teeth, some so weathered they were little more than nameless stones. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of overgrown grass and cracked headstones. As she walked, the cemetery was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Emily forced herself to stay calm, chalking it up to nerves. She began taking pictures and jotting down notes about the atmosphere, the sense of decay, the oppressive stillness. Then she heard it. Faint at first, like the murmur of distant voices carried on the wind. She paused, straining to listen, but the sound faded. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as her imagination and pressed on, heading deeper into the cemetery. The further she ventured, the more oppressive the air became, as though the night itself were pressing in on her. As she approached the oldest part of the graveyard, she noticed an open grave ahead. The earth was freshly disturbed, the pit yawning like a black wound in the ground. Nearby, a weathered shovel leaned against a crumbling mausoleum. A wave of unease washed over her. Why would anyone be digging here so late at night? She decided to investigate, crouching at the edge of the grave. Her flashlight flickered as she aimed it into the hole. It was deeper than she expected, the bottom swallowed by shadow. Suddenly, her flashlight sputtered and died, plunging her into darkness. She cursed, fumbling to tap it back to life, but it refused to turn on. The murmurs returned, louder now and undeniably real. They surrounded her, a chaotic symphony of whispers in an unknown language. Panic gripped her as she stumbled back from the grave, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind, a trick of acoustics, anything but what it felt like. Then she saw them. Pale, translucent shapes materializing in the distance, weaving between the tombstones. Their forms shimmered like heat waves, but their faces, indistinct and hollow, seemed to stare straight through her. Emily froze, her legs rooted to the spot. The figures moved with deliberate slowness, gliding toward her, their whispers growing louder, almost deafening. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. Her path twisted and turned, the once familiar markers becoming an endless maze. The whispers pursued her, relentless and taunting, until they crescendoed into a bone-chilling wail that made her ears ring. Finally, she reached the gate, her hands trembling as she pushed it open and stumbled onto the dirt road. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, the cold night pressing against her skin. Looking back, the cemetery was silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Emily returned to her apartment, shaken but determined to review the footage from her camera. When she plugged it into her computer, her stomach dropped. The screen flickered to life, showing the cemetery bathed in darkness. But it wasn't the eerie stillness that froze her blood. It was the figure standing in the background of every frame. A man in a tattered coat holding a shovel, his face obscured by shadows. He never moved, yet somehow he seemed closer in each successive shot. The final image showed him standing directly behind her, his empty eyes staring into the lens. Emily never wrote her article. She left Willow Glen the next morning, refusing to speak of what had happened. But the locals knew. They'd seen her type before. Outsiders too curious for their own good. They'd heard the whispers about Black Hollow and its restless keeper, and they knew that no one truly left the cemetery behind. The town of Ashridge was shrouded in secrets. its unspoken history buried as deeply as its dead. At the heart of its dark legacy stood Ravenshade Cemetery, an ancient graveyard nestled in a hollow surrounded by gnarled oaks. Time had gnawed at its headstones, leaving many broken and illegible. But the cemetery's true terror lay not in its decay, but in the crypt at its center. A massive stone structure built into the earth, its entrance sealed by a rusting iron door. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the crypt, calling it the Vault of the Screaming Dead. Legend claimed that anyone who dared open the door would hear the cries of those entombed within, desperate, pleading voices begging for release. Despite its terrifying reputation, there were always a few foolhardy souls willing to test the legend. One such soul was Adam, a history student and amateur paranormal investigator. He had heard the stories and dismissed them as folklore, relics of an overactive imagination in a town steeped in superstition. But he was fascinated by the mystery of the crypt and determined to uncover the truth. Armed with his camera, audio recorder, and a crowbar, Adam ventured into Ravenshade one moonless night. The cemetery was still and oppressive, the air thick with a scent of earth and decay. Adam felt the weight of the place pressing on him as he approached the crypt, its iron door looming in the faint beam of his flashlight. For a moment he hesitated, the cold grip of fear tightening around him. But he shook it off, reminding himself that he was there for answers. The iron door groaned in protest as he pried it open, the sound echoing through the cemetery like a warning. The stench that billowed out was overpowering, a sickly blend of rot and something metallic. Adam gagged, pulling his shirt over his nose as he stepped inside. The crypt was larger than he had imagined, its stone walls slick with moisture and streaked with dark stains. Niches carved into the walls held crumbling coffins, and the floor was littered with bones and shattered remains of urns. As he shone his flashlight across the space, the beam caught something strange. Scratch marks etched into the stone, as though made by desperate fingers. A chill ran down Adam's spine, but he pressed on, snapping pictures and taking notes. The silence was heavy, the kind that seemed to absorb sound, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He set his recorder on a crumbling pedestal and began asking questions, his voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone here? What happened to you? Why are you trapped?" For a few moments there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing. Then the recorder crackled. A faint whisper emerged, almost imperceptible but unmistakably there. "Help me." Adam froze, his blood turning to ice. He stared at the recorder, his mind racing to rationalize the voice. A draft, an echo. He played the recording back, and the whisper was still there, clearer now. It was a woman's voice, weak and filled with despair. "Please, help us." He felt the urge to leave, but curiosity won out. He called out again. "Who are you? Why are you here?" This time the response wasn't a whisper. A guttural scream erupted from the recorder, so loud and piercing that Adam dropped it. The sound seemed to reverberate through the crypt, growing louder, as if 100 voices were screaming in unison. The walls vibrated, dust raining from the ceiling as the room seemed to come alive with rage and anguish. Adam bolted for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening clang. Panic gripped him as he yanked at the handle, his hands slipping on the cold metal. Behind him, the screaming continued, joined by a chorus of frantic whispers, their words incomprehensible but full of malice. The flashlight flickered, casting the room in strobe-like flashes. In those brief bursts of light, Adam saw them, shadows moving across the walls, their forms twisted and broken, their hollow eyes fixed on him. One by one, they began emerging from the walls, their skeletal hands reaching out, their mouths open in silent, agonized screams. Adam pounded on the door, his voice hoarse as he begged for escape. His flashlight died completely, plunging him into darkness. The last thing he heard was the scrape of nails on stone and the hiss of a voice close to his ear. "Stay with us." When the caretaker found the crypt the next morning, the door was ajar, the lock broken. Inside, there was no sign of Adam, only his camera and recorder lying in the dust. The footage on the camera showed him entering the crypt and filming its interior, but the video ended abruptly with him spinning toward the camera, his face frozen in a mask of terror. The recorder was worse. When played back, it was filled with the sounds of Adam screaming, his cries blending with the cacophony of other voices. The final words on the tape were barely audible over the chaos, but they chilled the caretaker to his core. "They're in the walls. They're in the walls." On the outskirts of the small, forgotten town of Dry Creek sat the decaying remains of an old churchyard, its cemetery long abandoned to the elements. Its history was a grim one. St. Ilara's church had burned to the ground over a century ago, taking most of the congregation with it. The townsfolk buried the victims in the cemetery surrounding the ruins, but it was said the land itself had soured after the fire. Strange lights flickered in the graveyard at night, and travelers who camped too close reported hearing faint screams carried on the wind. The townsfolk steered clear of the place, but there were always those who couldn't resist a good scare. One such group was a trio of friends, Tyler, Sam, and Rachel, visiting Dry Creek during a weekend road trip. The locals at the diner warned them about the cemetery, but Tyler, the most adventurous of the group, dismissed their stories as superstition. He convinced Sam and Rachel to explore the cemetery with him that night, promising it would make for a thrilling story. Under the cover of darkness, they made their way to the churchyard. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The wrought iron gate creaked as they pushed it open, the sound cutting through the stillness. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they stepped into the overgrown graveyard, the gravestones looming like shadowy sentinels. Rachel shivered, hugging her jacket closer. "This place feels wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tyler laughed nervously. "That's the point. Come on, let's see if we can find the ruins." The trio wandered deeper into the cemetery, the beams of their flashlights casting eerie shadows. The gravestones became more weathered and crooked the further they went, some sinking into the earth as if trying to escape. They found the remains of the church, a blackened stone foundation surrounded by charred beams, just as Tyler's flashlight began to flicker. "Great," Tyler muttered, smacking the flashlight against his palm. "Should have brought fresh batteries." Sam glanced around uneasily. "We shouldn't stay too long. It feels like we're being watched." Rachel nodded in agreement, but Tyler waved them off. "It's just nerves. Look, let's get a picture by the ruins and call it a night." They gathered near the foundation and Tyler set the camera on a timer. The flash illuminated the ruins for a brief moment, and Rachel thought she saw something, a faint, human-like shape standing among the gravestones. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. "Did you guys see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "See what?" Tyler said, reviewing the camera. His face paled. "What the hell?" Sam and Rachel crowded around him. In the photo, a figure stood behind them. A woman in a tattered dress, her face obscured by shadows. Her hands were outstretched as if reaching for them. Before they could react, a cold wind swept through the graveyard, extinguishing their flashlights. The darkness was absolute, and with it came a sound that made their blood run cold, the distant crackle of flames growing louder by the second. It was accompanied by muffled screams, a chorus of anguish and terror. "What is that?" Sam shouted, his voice breaking. Rachel grabbed his arm. "We need to leave. Now." But the screams were all around them, and the crackling flames seemed to close in. The trio stumbled through the darkness, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Tyler tripped over a root, his camera flying from his hand. As he scrambled to retrieve it, his flashlight flickered back to life, illuminating the ground in front of him. The woman from the photograph stood inches away, her hollow eyes locked on his. Her face was burned beyond recognition, her charred lips parting in a soundless scream. Tyler froze, paralyzed by terror as her hand reached for him. Sam and Rachel heard his scream and turned, but Tyler was gone. His flashlight lay on the ground, its beam illuminating nothing but empty space. Panic consumed them as they ran, their only thought to escape the graveyard. When they finally reached the gate, Rachel dared to look back. The cemetery was silent once more, the ruins bathed in moonlight. But she saw them, dozens of shadowy figures standing among the graves, their hollow eyes watching, their burned faces twisted in eternal agony. Sam and Rachel drove out of Dry Creek that night, leaving Tyler behind. When they returned with authorities the next day, there was no sign of him. His camera was found near the ruins, but the photographs it held were impossible to explain. The last image showed Tyler staring into the camera, his face frozen in a mask of terror. Behind him, the shadowy figures pressed closer, their charred hands reaching out. Neither Sam nor Rachel ever spoke of the cemetery again, but the people of Dry Creek knew the truth. The spirits of St. Ilara's church did not rest, and those who dared disturb their graveyards seldom returned. There is a place just outside the city of Ravenwood known only as Deadman's Grove. Few who know its name speak it aloud, for the grove is the stuff of nightmares. Hidden deep within the dense forest, at the end of an overgrown path that no map shows, lies a forgotten graveyard. It is said to be the burial ground of a 19th century cult, the Elders of the Void, who vanished mysteriously after performing a final, unspeakable ritual. The story begins with Ben, a young urban explorer obsessed with uncovering the world's hidden corners. When he stumbled upon an old journal at a flea market, he discovered a chilling entry describing Deadman's Grove. The author claimed to have found the cemetery, but warned that the dead there do not sleep. They wait. Ben was skeptical, but intrigued. He gathered his gear, a flashlight, a camera, a knife for protection, and set out alone, ignoring the warnings of the few locals who knew the legend. Nothing but ghost stories, he muttered as he entered the forest at dusk. The path to the grove was nearly invisible, choked by brambles and vines. As Ben pushed deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes against the dimming sky. He glanced at his compass, but the needle spun erratically, useless. Finally, as the last traces of sunlight vanished, he found it, a clearing shrouded in mist, its center dominated by weathered headstones and a crumbling stone altar. The ground was uneven, as if something had disturbed it recently. Ben felt a chill that went beyond the cold air. He raised his camera, snapping pictures of the eerie scene. As the flash illuminated the grove, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a shadow darting between the gravestones. He whipped around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. There was no answer, only the sound of leaves rustling. But there was no wind. Ben's nerves began to fray, but his curiosity pushed him onward. He approached the altar, its surface carved with strange symbols that seemed to writhe under his gaze. At its base lay a shallow pit filled with what appeared to be animal bones, or so he hoped. Then he heard it. A low, guttural whisper, barely audible but unmistakably real. "Leave." Ben's heart raced as he scanned the darkness, his flashlight revealing only trees and tombstones. The whisper came again, louder, more insistent. "Leave, before they wake." He turned to run, but the path back was gone, swallowed by the forest. Panic set in as the whispering grew, multiplying into a chorus of voices all around him. They spoke no language he understood, but the tone was clear. Anger, hatred, hunger. The mist thickened, and with it came shadows, figures emerging from the ground, their forms skeletal and rotted, their eyes glowing with unnatural light. Ben stumbled backward, dropping his camera. The nearest figure, a woman in a tattered dress, raised a hand that ended in jagged, blackened nails. "You disturb their rest," she hissed, her voice a hollow echo. "Now, you will join them." Ben turned and ran, his legs barely carrying him through the oppressive fog. The whispers followed, rising to a deafening crescendo, the shadows closing in. He could feel their icy breath on his neck, hear their footsteps crunching the leaves behind him. At last, he burst from the grove, the mist dissipating as he reached the edge of the forest. He didn't stop running until he was back at his car, gasping for air and shaking uncontrollably. He looked back, but the path to Deadman's Grove had vanished. He drove home in silence, too shaken to think. But his ordeal wasn't over. That night, as he reviewed the footage on his camera, his heart sank. The final image was a blur of movement, but in its center was a face, pale, decayed, with hollow eyes staring straight at him. The whispers began again as the lights in his apartment flickered. Ben was never seen again. Some say he returned to Deadman's Grove, drawn by the voices that now haunted him. Others claim the dead came to claim him, ensuring their secret would remain buried. The grove remains hidden, but the locals know better than to look for it. They say the Elders of the Void still guard their sacred ground, and those foolish enough to disturb them are never truly allowed to leave. In the remote hills of Harrow Ridge, there's an old cemetery that no one speaks of. Not because they've forgotten it, no. The cemetery is etched into the town's collective memory like a scar. Its name, Blackthorn Rest, is rarely uttered aloud. Parents warn their children to stay away, and even the bravest hunters avoid the forest that surrounds it. But those warnings didn't stop a group of 4 college students, Mark, Jess, Olivia, and Eric, from deciding to visit on a dare. The legend of Blackthorn Rest was irresistible to them. It was said that in the 1800s, the cemetery was used as a dumping ground for the bodies of those accused of witchcraft, people who were tortured and executed in secret. But the real horror lay in the tale of the Watcher, a ghostly figure said to roam the cemetery, its eyeless sockets ever vigilant, punishing intruders who dared to set foot on its cursed ground. It was nearly midnight when they arrived. The dirt road leading to the cemetery was long overgrown, forcing them to park their car and hike through the dense forest. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to lean toward them, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Olivia shivered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" she asked, glancing nervously at the others. Mark grinned, his bravado masking his unease. "Come on, Liv. It's just a bunch of old graves. Besides, it's for the thrill." The group finally broke through the tree line, and there it was, Blackthorn Rest. The cemetery sprawled before them like a forgotten wasteland. The headstones were jagged and crumbling, some toppled over, others swallowed by the earth. In the center loomed a mausoleum, its stone facade cracked and weathered, an iron gate hanging ajar. Jess pulled out her phone to record their adventure, panning the camera across the graves. "This place is seriously creepy," she whispered. Eric laughed nervously. "Creepy? This is the stuff of horror movies." As they wandered through the graveyard, a cold wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was too soft to make out words, but it was there, persistent, growing louder with each passing minute. Olivia stopped, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Mark shrugged, his flashlight beam sweeping over a headstone. "It's the wind. Relax." But the others heard it too. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding them, echoing off the stones. Jess's phone buzzed in her hand, and she looked down to see her recording glitching. The screen distorted, flashes of static and shadow overtaking the image. "What the hell?" she muttered, her voice trembling. That's when they saw it. A shadow moved between the headstones, impossibly fast, slipping in and out of their flashlight beams. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its presence made the air feel heavier, suffocating. Eric's voice cracked as he shouted, "Who's there?" The only response was the whispering, now louder, more distinct. They weren't alone. Mark, ever the skeptic, stomped toward the mausoleum. "Enough with the theatrics. It's probably some local messing with us." He pushed the creaking iron gate open and stepped inside, his flashlight casting shaky light on the dusty interior. The others followed reluctantly, and that's when Jess noticed the writing on the walls. Words were scratched into the stone, jagged and uneven, as if made by desperate hands. They watch, they see, they take. A cold breath of air swept through the mausoleum, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Olivia screamed as the whispers turned to guttural growls, the sound reverberating through the air. A sharp metallic sound echoed, a lock clicking into place. The gate had slammed shut. Eric fumbled with his phone's flashlight, its weak beam barely illuminating the space. That's when they saw it. Standing in the corner of the mausoleum, its head tilted unnaturally, was the Watcher. The creature was humanoid, but horribly wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its skeletal frame, and its face was void of eyes, only gaping holes where they should have been. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and emitted a guttural screech that shook them to their cores. Panic erupted. Mark and Eric rammed the gate, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Olivia clutched Jess, her sobs choking in her throat as the Watcher moved closer, each step impossibly slow yet deliberate. The whispers were deafening now, chanting in an ancient, guttural language. The walls of the mausoleum seemed to pulse, the air growing thick and oppressive. "Let us out!" Mark screamed, his fists pounding against the gate. The Watcher stopped inches away from them, tilting its head as if studying them. Then, with a sudden, jerking motion, it raised a long, claw-like hand and pointed at Jess. "No!" Jess shrieked, but it was too late. The Watcher lunged, and the lights went out. When Mark, Eric, and Olivia woke hours later, they were outside the cemetery, lying on the forest floor. The path to Blackthorn Rest was gone, replaced by unbroken wilderness. Jess was nowhere to be found. Terrified and disoriented, they fled back to their car and left Harrow Ridge, swearing never to return. But Jess's disappearance remained a mystery, one the locals shrugged off with grim understanding. "She's with the Watcher now," they'd say, "and she's not coming back." Blackthorn Rest still stands, waiting for the next foolhardy souls to venture into its cursed grounds, and somewhere in the darkness, The watcher waits, its eyeless gaze fixed on the living. There's a stretch of road outside the town of Bramble Hollow, known as Widow's Way. On one side lies the dense Blackvale Forest, and on the other, an old cemetery nearly hidden by overgrown brush. The townsfolk say the cemetery has no name. It predates the town itself. Some graves are marked with strange symbols rather than names, and others are sunken into the earth, as if the dead were trying to pull themselves deeper. No one tends to it, and no one dares to visit after sundown. The legend of Widow's Way begins with a woman named Marion Bell, a reclusive widow who lived on the edge of the cemetery in the early 1900s. It's said that Marion was not just a widow, but also a witch, someone who dabbled in dark rituals and communed with the dead. When her husband died mysteriously, the town turned on her, blaming her for everything from failed crops to the disappearance of children. One night, a mob dragged her from her home and hanged her from an old oak tree at the edge of the cemetery. Before she died, Marion swore vengeance, cursing the town and vowing that none who disturbed her resting place would escape alive. The story seemed like just another local legend until 3 high school friends decided to test it. Lila, Danny, and Mike were thrill seekers, always looking for the next scare. On Halloween night, armed with flashlights and a Ouija board, they dared each other to spend an hour in the cemetery. The dare was simple. They had to find Marion's grave, sit on it, and summon her spirit. The trio parked on the side of Widow's Way, their headlights barely penetrating the wall of darkness. The air was cold and unnaturally still as they climbed over the rusting cemetery gate, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown path. The headstones loomed like jagged teeth in the moonlight, and the deeper they ventured, the more the air seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. "This is stupid," Lila whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "We don't even know which grave is hers." Mike laughed, though it sounded forced. "Relax, it's just a bunch of old rocks. We'll pick a grave, do the stupid ritual, and call it a night." Danny pointed to a cracked headstone near the center of the cemetery. Its surface was engraved with strange, looping symbols that looked like they were carved in haste. The ground around it was bare, as if no grass dared to grow there. "That has to be it," Danny said, his voice low. They gathered around the grave, placing the Ouija board on its surface. The air grew colder, and a faint breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it a smell of earth and rot. Lila hesitated, but sat down on the grave, her heart pounding as Danny and Mike joined her. They placed their fingers on the planchette. "Marion Bell," Mike said, his voice wavering. "If you're here, give us a sign." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette jerked, pulling their fingers with it. Lila gasped, looking around to see if one of the boys was messing with her, but their wide eyes told her they weren't. The board spelled out, "Leave." A nervous laugh escaped Danny. "Okay, very funny. Let's..." Before he could finish, a loud cracking sound echoed through the cemetery. The old oak tree near the entrance bent unnaturally, its branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath them began to shift, softening as if the grave were sinking. "Guys, we should go," Leela stammered, standing up quickly. Her legs felt heavy, like something was pulling at her. The wind picked up, howling through the cemetery and carrying whispers that surrounded them. The whispers grew louder, blending into Marion's voice, raspy, venomous, and filled with rage. "You dare disturb me?" The flashlight beams flickered, and for a moment everything went dark. When the light returned, Marion was there, standing just beyond the grave. Her form was skeletal, her face pale and hollow, with empty black sockets where her eyes should have been. A noose hung loosely around her neck, and her feet hovered inches above the ground. Lila screamed, and the 3 of them bolted toward the gate. But the cemetery had changed. The paths twisted, the headstones seeming to rise and block their way. The whispers grew deafening, and behind them, Marion floated closer, her outstretched hands clawed and dripping with something dark. "Leave now," she hissed, her voice vibrating through their bones. "But leave a piece of yourselves behind." Danny tripped, falling hard onto a grave. He cried out, his ankle twisted, but the others couldn't stop. Lila turned back for him, but Marion was already there, her clawed hand reaching down to him. His screams cut through the air, and then he was gone, dragged beneath the soil as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Lila and Mike burst through the cemetery gate, collapsing on the side of the road. They didn't stop until they reached their car. hearts pounding and tears streaming down their faces. As they sped away, they didn't dare look back. The next day, the town found Danny's body lying at the base of the oak tree. His face was frozen in terror, his eyes missing, and his hands clutching the noose that hung from his neck. Lila and Mike never spoke of what happened that night, but they both moved away from Bramble Hollow soon after. The cemetery remains untouched, its gates rusting further into disrepair. But at night, if you drive past Widow's Way, you might see her, Marion Bell, her eyeless face watching, her ghostly form waiting for the next soul foolish enough to disturb her grave. There's a stretch of land in the Appalachian Mountains known as Wraithwood Hollow, a place avoided by locals and travelers alike. The dense forest that surrounds it seems to drink in the light, even on the brightest days, and at its heart lies an ancient cemetery. The graves are unmarked, their stones weathered to shapeless forms. Legend has it that Wraithwood Hollow was once home to a secretive religious sect that performed rituals to summon something that was never meant to be unleashed. Ellie, a freelance journalist, had spent years chasing urban legends. When she heard of the Hollow and its cursed cemetery, she couldn't resist the story. She ignored the warnings of locals, dismissing their tales of disappearances and ghostly figures as superstition. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a journal, Ellie ventured into the woods one chilly October evening. The path leading to the cemetery was overgrown, choked with thorny vines and moss-covered roots. The deeper Ellie went, the quieter the forest became. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, everything fell silent, leaving only the sound of her own footsteps. When she finally reached the cemetery, she was struck by its eerie beauty. The graves were arranged in a haphazard fashion, leaning and crumbling as if trying to collapse under the weight of centuries. A gnarled tree stood at the center, its twisted branches forming a canopy over a stone altar. Ellie began taking photos, muttering notes into her voice recorder. Unmarked graves could be settlers' possible ritual site. Her voice wavered as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of chanting. She paused, straining to listen. The chanting grew louder, though she could see no one. It wasn't in English or any language she recognized. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, but she forced herself to stay calm. It was probably the wind, she thought. As she moved closer to the altar, her flashlight flickered. She slapped it against her palm, cursing the cheap batteries when the beam stabilized, illuminating something carved into the altar's surface. "Do not disturb the restless." Ellie frowned, snapping a photo. The moment her camera flashed, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, slowly, she began to hear something else. The sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and getting closer. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. But the footsteps continued, circling her in the darkness just beyond her flashlight's reach. She spun around, her beam darting between the graves. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, too quick to be trees swaying in the wind. Her heart pounded as she tried to convince herself it was her imagination. She turned back toward the altar, but stopped dead in her tracks. Standing in front of it was a figure cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by darkness. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, as if it were draining the air from her lungs. "Who are you?" Ellie demanded, her voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, and for a brief moment, she saw its face, or what should have been its face. There was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to ripple like water. Ellie screamed and stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. She scrambled to pick it up, the beam now weaker and flickering wildly. The figure was gone. She didn't wait to see if it would return. Turning on her heels, she ran, her footsteps crunching through the dead leaves. But the path back was no longer there. The forest seemed to twist around her, the trees pressing closer together, their branches clawing at her as if trying to hold her back. The chanting resumed, louder and more frenzied, echoing all around her. She turned in circles, desperately trying to find the source, but the voices were everywhere. Then she saw them. Figures emerging from the graves, their movements slow and jerky, as if they hadn't walked in centuries. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their faces were twisted masks of decay and rage. "No. No, no, no," Ellie whispered, stumbling away. But no matter which way she turned, the figures were there, closing in. She tripped over a root and fell, her flashlight tumbling from her hand. It rolled away, casting its weak beam on the altar. The shadowy figure from before was standing there again, watching her. "Please," Ellie begged, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The chanting stopped, replaced by a single voice, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the hollow. "You were warned." The figures lunged at her, their icy hands grabbing her arms, her legs, her face. She screamed as they dragged her toward the altar, her flashlight flickering out completely. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the shadowy figure reaching out, its featureless face inches from hers. Ellie's car was found 2 days later, abandoned at the edge of the forest. Search parties combed Wraithwood Hollow but found no trace of her, only her camera lying near the altar. The photos on it were blurred and distorted except for the last one, a shot of the altar with the shadowy figure standing behind it, its featureless face turned toward the lens. The locals of Bramble Hollow now speak of Ellie in hushed tones, adding her name to the long list of those who vanished in the cursed woods. Wraithwood Hollow remains untouched, a place where the restless still roam and the shadows never sleep. There's an abandoned cemetery deep in the heart of Bitterroot Valley, hidden by a dense forest that locals call the Silent Pines. No birds sing there, no animals roam, and the trees seem to grow unnaturally tall, their spindly branches twisting like skeletal hands. The cemetery, known only as Ashwood Hollow, is infamous for a chilling legend. Anyone who visits and hears the toll of its ghostly bell will never leave the forest alive. For decades, the story of the bell kept people away, but that didn't stop Riley, a thrill seeker with a knack for chasing the paranormal. Riley had heard the legend from an old folklore blog and decided to investigate, believing it was just another exaggerated ghost story. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and a digital recorder, Riley ventured into the forest one cold, foggy night, determined to find the cemetery and uncover its secrets. The hike to Ashwood Hollow was grueling. The air grew colder with each step, and an eerie silence enveloped the forest. It wasn't the normal quiet of a woodland at night. It was oppressive, as if the forest were holding its breath. Riley pressed on, brushing aside the creeping sense of unease. After hours of walking, Riley stumbled upon it. The cemetery lay in a sunken clearing, overrun with weeds and brambles. The headstones were ancient, their inscriptions eroded by time. At the center of the graveyard stood a decrepit bell tower, leaning precariously to one side. Its bell, a massive iron monstrosity, was cracked but still intact. Riley felt a chill run down their spine as they stared at the bell tower. "Just a story," they whispered to themselves, taking a deep breath and stepping into the cemetery. The ground felt wrong beneath their feet, soft, almost spongy, as if something shifted beneath the soil. Riley ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. They wandered among the graves, taking notes and snapping photos. The silence was so profound that the sound of the camera's shutter echoed unnervingly. As Riley moved closer to the bell tower, a faint sound broke the stillness, a low, distant hum. They froze, straining to hear. The hum grew louder, transforming into the unmistakable toll of a bell. Bong! The sound reverberated through the air, shaking Riley to their core. They looked up at the bell tower in disbelief. The bell was swaying, its cracked surface catching the pale moonlight. But there was no wind, nothing to make it move. "Hello," Lee called out, their voice trembling. The toll came again, louder this time. Bong! Suddenly, the air grew icy, and the fog thickened, swirling like a living thing. Riley's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Panic set in as they realized they were no longer alone. From the corner of their eye, Riley saw movement. They spun around, shining their flashlight toward the graves. Figures were emerging from the ground, gray, skeletal forms wrapped in tattered burial shrouds. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. The bell tolled again, its sound vibrating through the ground. The figures turned toward Riley, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. "Nope. Nope, nope, nope," Riley muttered, backing away. They turned to run, but stumbled over a headstone, landing hard on the damp earth. The flashlight flew from their hand, its beam illuminating the base of the bell tower. Standing there was something worse than the skeletal figures. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its form shifting like smoke. Its face, if it had one, was a void, an abyss that seemed to draw all light into it. The figure raised an impossibly long arm, pointing directly at Riley. The bell tolled once more, louder than ever, and the ground beneath Riley began to shift. Hands, cold, bony, and relentless, burst from the soil, grabbing at their arms and legs. Riley screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the hands were unyielding, pulling them downward into the earth. "Help! Someone, help!" Riley screamed, their voice echoing uselessly in the dead forest. The last thing they saw was the shadowy figure towering over them, its void-like face descending until it was inches away. A single whisper escaped its unseen mouth, chilling and final. "You heard the bell." Riley was never seen again. Days later, search parties combed the forest, but Ashwood Hollow eluded them. The cemetery seemed to vanish, leaving no trace except for Riley's abandoned notebook. Inside, scrawled on the last page, were the words, "The bell tolls for those who dare to listen." Locals say that on foggy nights, you can still hear the bell echoing through the forest. Those who follow its sound are never heard from again. The silent pines stand as a grim warning, a place where the living dare not tread, and where the dead are never truly at rest. In the outskirts of a quiet New England town lies Blackthorn Asylum, a crumbling relic of the 19th century. It has been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its halls consumed by shadows. The asylum's reputation is steeped in horror, whispers of cruel experiments, patients disappearing, and something far worse lurking within. Locals claim that after the asylum closed, a single light began appearing in the attic window, flickering late into the night. No one dared to investigate. But Jackson, a budding urban explorer, saw the asylum as a perfect challenge for his growing YouTube channel. He convinced his girlfriend Maya and their friend Trent to join him. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and nerves of steel, they set out one stormy night, eager to uncover the truth about Blackthorn's dark history. The asylum loomed like a blackened skeleton against the stormy sky, its stone walls streaked with moss and grime. Lightning flashed, illuminating the broken iron gates and the overgrown grounds. "This place is unreal," Jackson whispered, grinning as he filmed the towering structure. "Unreal is one word for it," Maya muttered, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. They pried open the rusted front doors, the sound of the hinges screaming through the empty halls. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint stench of mildew and decay. Their footsteps echoed as they ventured deeper, the flickering beams of their flashlights revealing graffiti-covered walls, overturned gurneys, and broken furniture. "This is where they kept the criminally insane," Jackson said, reading from a printed-out history of the asylum. Some of the patients claimed they saw things in the shadows. "What kind of things?" Trent asked, his voice tinged with nervous laughter. "Figures that weren't human. The staff thought it was just psychosis." "Great bedtime story, Jackson," Maya snapped. "Can we keep moving?" They continued exploring, their cameras capturing the eerie remnants of a place once filled with suffering. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, as though the walls were pressing in on them. When they reached the central staircase, Jackson stopped, his flashlight aimed upward. "The attic," he said, pointing to a narrow, spiraling staircase leading into darkness. "You're kidding, right?" Maya said. "That's where the light is supposed to appear," Jackson replied, already climbing. Reluctantly, Maya and Trent followed. The attic door was ajar, its hinges groaning as Jackson pushed it open. The space beyond was massive, filled with forgotten artifacts, rusted bed frames, cracked mirrors, and piles of yellowed documents. At the far end stood a single chair facing a tall, arched window. "Creepy," Trent muttered, filming the scene. The storm outside intensified, thunder shaking the building. As lightning illuminated the attic, Maya gasped. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure sitting in the chair, a hunched silhouette with its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" Jackson asked, turning his flashlight toward the chair. It was empty. Maya shook her head, trying to dismiss the image. "Never mind." As Jackson inspected the documents, Trent wandered toward the window. His camera captured something strange, faint scratches on the walls, forming symbols he didn't recognize. "Hey guys, look at this," Trent said, tracing the marks with his fingers. The moment he touched them, the attic door slammed shut. The sound reverberated like a gunshot, and all their flashlights flickered before plunging them into darkness. "What the hell was that?" Maya cried, her voice trembling. Jackson fumbled with his flashlight, smacking it until it came back on. The beam revealed something new, the chair now overturned, and a trail of wet footprints leading toward the staircase. "Those weren't there before," Jackson whispered. "Let's get out of here," Maya said, backing toward the door. Before they could move, a voice echoed through the attic, low, guttural, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come." The flashlights flickered again, and when they stabilized, they were not alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms gaunt and twisted. Their faces were featureless, their movements jerky and unnatural. They stood between the group and the staircase, blocking their only escape. Trent screamed as one of the figures lunged, its skeletal hand grabbing his arm. He dropped his camera, which clattered to the floor, its lens capturing the chaos. "Run!" Jackson shouted, pulling Maya toward the far end of the attic. But there was nowhere to go. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, trapping them in a labyrinth of decaying furniture and walls that weren't there before. The figures closed in, their raspy breaths filling the air. "Leave us alone!" Maya screamed, swinging her flashlight wildly. The light struck one of the figures, and it recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a pipe. "Light! They hate the light!" Jackson shouted. They turned their flashlights on the figures, forcing them to retreat slightly, but the batteries were already weakening. The beams flickered, and the figures began advancing again, their forms twisting into something even more grotesque. Suddenly, the attic window shattered, letting in a burst of lightning. The light illuminated the room, revealing the true horror. The figures weren't just spirits. They were the tortured remains of Blackthorn's patients, their bodies fused with the darkness itself. In the chaos, Trent broke free and bolted toward the staircase, only to stop dead. His scream echoed as he was dragged backward into the shadows, disappearing completely. Maya and Jackson didn't wait. They sprinted down the stairs, the shadows chasing them. The hallways twisted around them, the asylum itself coming alive, trying to keep them trapped. When they finally burst through the front doors and into the storm, they didn't stop running until they reached their car. Trent was never found. The footage recovered from his camera showed only fragments of what happened in the attic. The figures, the scratches, and a final chilling frame of the chair upright again, with something sitting in it, watching. Blackthorn Asylum still stands, its attic window glowing faintly on stormy nights. Locals warn that those who see the light and enter will join the shadows, forever lost in the asylum's embrace.